From the very beginning, Severance has always been a reflection on the state of a modern world and what it means to be human in a capitalistic modern society. There are quite a few video essays and pieces about this already, but given the new revelations we were shown, I wanted to delve a bit more into the philosophy behind Kier, Lumon, the Severance procedure, and how that relates to deeper, wider themes that the show is exploring. First, I think it's important to start with what Kier Eagan's beliefs actually are. Bear with me here because I do think understanding this elucidates what Lumon is trying to do, but more importantly, why they are trying to do it. Although Lumon and the Eagan family's beliefs seem to draw inspiration from multiple religions and cults, there is an aspect of it that is decidedly biblical in nature. While it is possible that the goats are just a running gag that the writers committed to due to the sheer absurdity, personally I think that they might symbolize something significant at the heart of Kier's beliefs. Note that I'm going to talk about the following as a non-religious person myself, but I will do my best to explain everything based on my research on the topic. There's a well-known ritual and story described in the Bible that involves a pair of goats, and it is also the origin of our modern word, scapegoat. Quoting the first line from the Wikipedia page, in the Bible, a scapegoat is one of a pair of kid goats that is released into the wilderness, taking with it all sins and impurities, while the other is sacrificed. While there are multiple versions of the story and ritual depending on the translation and the specific faith, each version involves drawing lots to decide the fate of the two goats. Ultimately, one of them is chosen to symbolically carry away the sins of the community. Regardless of the details, the important part of this story seems to be the idea of placing all your sins and impurities onto another, whether that's a goat, a person, or a part of yourself, and severing it from the community or yourself. An interesting footnote to this section harkens back to the original break room from season 1, which heavily evoked themes of repentance and confession. The lines that Viennese were made to recite sound almost like a religious mantra.
Forgive me for the harm I have caused this world. None may atone for my actions but me. And only in me shall their stain live on. I am thankful to have been caught, my fall cut short by those with wizened hands. All I can be is sorry, and that is all I am.
In the original Hebrew biblical texts, the goat sacrifice ceremony is done by a high priest, who lays a hand on the scapegoat and recites the following: O Lord, I have acted iniquitously, trespassed, sinned before thee. I, my household, and the sons of Aaron, thy holy ones. O Lord, forgive the iniquities, transgressions, and sins that I, my household, and Aaron's children, thy holy people, committed before thee, as is written in the law of Moses, thy servant. For on this day he will forgive you, to cleanse you from all your sins before the Lord. Ye shall be clean. While doing my research, I was struck by how similar in tone the breakroom lines felt to the biblical lines above. Personally believe that the tale of the scapegoat struck a deep chord with Kier Eagan, and is perhaps the seed of inspiration for developing his own beliefs about the world and about humanity.
Woe, frolic, dread, malice. Each man's character is defined by the precise ratio that resides in him. I walked into the cave of my own mind, and there I tamed them.
From what we know so far, his idea of enlightenment seems to revolve around a kind of purification, or rather, compartmentalization of the self. The story we heard during the Ortbo is significant in understanding this.
Dita became on that night an instrument of nature.
And nature played Dita with elegance. I had no choice but to listen as he spilt his lineage upon the soil.
I turned from my gargling brother and walked to the pool of the hollow, where I knew the waterfall would drown out my brother's cries. She She spoke to me directly from her eyes and said, "This is your doing. You suffered his wantonness. Now he's no one's brother, only chaos's whore."
Personally, I don't think Kier ever had a twin brother. His twin was probably a side of himself that he was ashamed of, a side that indulged in his opinion at least, sin and lust. Instead of working through his own complicated emotions and internal conflict, and reconciling that part of him with his whole self-identity, Kier chose to cast out that part of him completely. He murdered his twin in the forest, and with him, what he believed to be the tainted parts of himself that he was ashamed of. It was a symbolic purification ritual. While at the time Kier did this symbolically, I believe the idea at the heart of Severance is a direct result of this belief. Perhaps older believers ascribe to the idea that through mental willpower, asceticism, and self-repression, it's possible to reach Kier's idea of enlightenment on your own. To be able to completely cut off all parts of yourself that experience shameful or negative emotions. However, as we get to the modern day, I think more contemporary followers of his realized a way to reach this enlightenment through the use of technology. What if it could invent a way to circumvent the long and imperfect process of refining yourself through mental, behavioral, and emotional control? What if they could find a way to literally sever the self into many selves, each one perfectly calibrated to bear the multitude of sins, suffering, and imperfections that would taint a pure and holy life and self? I believe, especially from the deluge of information we were given from the latest episode, that this is what Lumon is trying to accomplish. And this is also what Lumon is trying to sell to the world. The idea of enlightenment, a way to live a perfect life, become a perfect self, free not just from the most painful of life's suffering, but from even the most minor inconveniences or negative emotions. In Kier's philosophy, this would be the ultimate utopia. Kier was wrong, though. His vision is not one that leads to utopia or enlightenment, but to the most extreme kind of dehumanization and sterilization of the self. Which leads to the next part. What would life be like if we followed Kier's logic and the goals of the Severance chip to their natural conclusion? Among many things, Severance reflects on identity and the multitude of selves that one contains. The premise of the show is already a play on how many people naturally become different versions of themselves in different environments, such as the person we are when we're around friends and the version we are at a workplace. To a large extent, this fluidity of identity is a normal part of being human, as we adapt to different norms and needs of the context that we are in. However, there are other, more harmful ways this manifests, harmful to ourselves and harmful to others. I'll address the former first. There are many situations where we are forced to metaphorically sever ourselves in our day-to-day lives, in an act of self-dehumanization, whether it's due to self-repression, shame, survival, or trauma. Although there are quite a few examples of this in the show, one example I really want to focus on is Seth Milchek. The scene where Milchek receives those awful blackface paintings of Kier and is expected to smile and be grateful is exceptionally powerful. It is the first time that the show explicitly acknowledges Milchek's place in this predominantly white company, and how he has had to mold himself into a specific kind of person to thrive there. Him being reprimanded for using complicated words is a direct nod to how people of color in reality are often criticized for over-intellectualizing and forced to dumb themselves down for the comfort and preconceived notions of white people.
You must eradicate from your essence childish folly. You must eradicate from yourself childish folly. You must abandon childish things. You must grow up. You must grow up. Grow up. Grow up. Grow up. Grow. 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 Grow.
Milchek speaking to himself in the mirror and harshly severing away the parts of himself that use these eloquent words is a painfully realistic representation of the way many people of color in real life are forced to split off certain parts of themselves, piece by piece, to fit a preconceived mold. In a similar vein to how Kier might have felt it to be a virtuous act to cast off the sinful parts of himself, Milchek is being expected to cast off the quote-unquote less desirable parts of him, at least in the eyes of his white supervisors. And this act isn't seen as demeaning or self-repressing in Lumon's eyes. It's seen as a kind of necessary self-refinement. There are so many examples in real life of marginalized people and communities being forced to compromise parts of themselves to survive, repressing parts of their identity out of internalized shame or fear or out of real danger. People, particularly minorities, often have extensive experience changing the way we speak, dress, behave, and hold ourselves based on where we are or the people we are around. We have to become different versions of ourselves based on the situation we're in and adapt for survival and safety. Without the space to reconcile or reintegrate all of these selves and embrace yourself wholeheartedly, there is a real danger of losing yourself entirely in the process. Which makes me ask the question, if Lumon has a monopoly on these severance chips and the ability to calibrate them at will, what kind of characteristics or emotions or experiences would they deem as positive and pure, and what kind would they deem as negative or dirty? Similarly to how online algorithms unconsciously shape who we are and how they can often enable, if not downright encourage, discriminatory beliefs and harmful status quos, Kier's technologically enabled quote-unquote utopia has wider implications not only for an individual's own happiness, but for what society regards as desirable or undesirable in human beings. The way we can sever ourselves into different versions of ourselves can also manifest in ways that result in great harm to other people. There is another quite chilling implication to the severance procedure that we saw from the conversation with Bert during that extremely awkward dinner. The idea that one can sever a version of themselves to go to heaven, while another version of themselves is condemned to hell. I sometimes find myself asking myself, how is it that people can commit atrocities, utterly inhumane and cruel acts, yet still be able to go home to their family and live perfectly ordinary lives? One aspect of it absolutely relates back to the ability of people to dehumanize other people. But another aspect of it, I believe, comes back to the compartmentalization of the self. In reality, people do this internally, psychologically. But in Severance, one can do this quite literally. People are sometimes able to do horrible, inhumane things by severing their own accountability and responsibility in the matter. In real life, it can sound something like, I was just following orders, or I was just doing my job. The man who goes home to his family after committing war crimes kisses his child goodnight without a second thought, because this version of him is a good father, a respectable husband. He can face his children, he can treat himself to a luxurious meal, he can watch TV with his legs up. Because of the terrifying ability for people to compartmentalize away and excuse the parts of themselves capable of committing great harm to others. Though of course this is just one amongst many reasons why people are able to do horrible things to each other. But I have to ask, what happens if people are given an even easier shortcut to compartmentalize themselves? What Lumon is offering is also a way for people to completely sever their own conscience and their responsibility to treat other people well, The Burt that was speaking was already fully convinced that he was going to hell, and honestly, he didn't seem all that bothered by it. He already believed that he had created a version of himself that would be allowed to go to heaven, because that version of him had nothing to do with whatever atrocities this version of him committed. So, what exactly is stopping this Burt from continuing to commit atrocities? After all, he is already condemned. In his eyes, there is seemingly no reason for him to stop. After all, this is a version of him that's meant to be the bad one, that's meant to do all the bad things that the other versions of him don't have to live with. And if he feels any guilt or regret, or if he feels any doubt or second guesses himself, he can simply just sever away that part of him that feels regret or guilt, and continue to do whatever he was doing.
Forgive me for the harm I have caused this world. None may atone for my actions, but me. And only in me shall their stain live on. All I can be is sorry. And that is all I am.
A huge part of becoming a better person is confronting and learning from the parts of yourself that hold harmful beliefs or are capable of doing harm to others. The ability to compartmentalize your responsibility over those parts away, or to partition them into a version of you that you don't need to feel accountability over, is a guaranteed way for you to never be able to grow past them. People are malleable and become different versions of themselves in different contexts and different environments. To be clear, I don't believe that the fluidity of human identity is an inherently bad thing. We all contain multitudes, and that can be a source of great strength and depth, as well as a source of harm and repression. It is the forceful compartmentalization and quantification of this complex aspect of being human that I question here. We don't reach enlightenment or happiness through avoidance, compartmentalization, or repression. We grow through challenging ourselves, allowing ourselves the space to feel whatever emotions we may feel, good or bad, through facing our fears and our pain, as well as taking accountability for our actions and being mindful of our place in the world and our connection to others. On face value, the idea of being able to skip past unpleasant parts of life might be tempting. After all, everyone has had that thought sometime or another. You're bored at work and glancing at a clock but doesn't seem to move. You're anxious at the dentist, and every minute in the waiting room feels like an hour. You're scrawling out the 50th Christmas thank you card, and you're tired and your hand hurts and each word seems to take an eternity to write. I keep thinking back to the initial idea that started the show. Dan was working at a job he hated at a door factory and found himself wishing he could just skip ahead the long, tedious 8 hours and wake back up again on his way out of work. And he wasn't the only one who felt that way. The idea unsettled him, though. The time we have in the world is so finite and short in the grand scheme of things, and yet not only is it possible that one would be okay with removing so much time from their life, but one might want to do so willingly and happily. Severance takes that idea to the extreme, not just severing your work self, but severing every part of yourself that might experience negative emotion, which forces us as an audience to reflect on what it actually means to live a fulfilling and happy life. Would we really necessarily be happy or enlightened if we were simply able to buy a product or a procedure that allows us to remove everything we find inconvenient, uncomfortable, or unpleasant? By the way, I'm going to ignore the wider implications, especially what this would mean for the innies, just for the sake of simplicity right now, but I will get to that in a bit. I think the resounding answer to all those questions, though, is no. We wouldn't be happy. I'm not sure we would even be human, not in the way that we all know and understand it. On a slight tangent, Kier Eagan actually reminds me a little bit of Brian Johnson. To those who don't know who he is, he's a real person, an exceptionally wealthy tech entrepreneur and venture capitalist who is completely and utterly obsessed with life extension and immortality. To achieve this, he attempts to perfectly optimize every aspect of his life, not allowing anything he deems even potentially harmful or negative. Every moment of his life is outsourced to a team of doctors who analyze data about his body and self to create a suffocatingly strict regimen to optimize his health. He's reduced himself to nothing but a machine to be refined and optimized to perfection. To quote an article about him, Johnson thinks of any act that accelerates aging, like eating a cookie or getting less than 8 hours of sleep, as an act of violence. Outsourcing the management of his body means defeating what Johnson calls his rascal mind, the part of us that wants to eat ice cream after dinner, or have sex at 1 a.m., or drink beer with friends. Every single day of his life is reduced down to a treatment, an exercise, or ritual meant to slow his aging and optimize his health. But the question we have to ask ourselves is Bryan Johnson happy? In my mind, if Kier Eagan existed in the modern day, he would probably be a Silicon Valley billionaire, so utterly obsessed with the idea of perfect optimization of every aspect of life and self, that he would lose any semblance of a meaningful life or self in that pursuit. Although Bryan Johnson's case is a bit different, I think in a way we can draw parallels between the way him and many extremely wealthy people like him think about the world, and the way Kier Eagan did. Sure, you can surgically remove anything that is potentially negative from your life, whether through an ultra-strict health routine or a chip in your head. But the question is, what else are you removing along with it? Whether we like it or not, life isn't a lump of earth we can refine away until we remove all impurities to arrive at some fantastical perfect compound or chemical. Life is messy, complicated, full of inconveniences and discomforts. Everyone isn't perfect, we all have our own fears, comfort zones, likes, dislikes, things we find joy from and things we find mind-numbingly tedious and boring. We make mistakes, we face our fears, we challenge ourselves, and we grow as humans from a multitude of experiences, not all of which are euphoric or perfect. Some of our happiest and most meaningful memories are imperfect, or complicated, or a result of obstacles and challenges we had to face along the way. It is not difficult to surmise that, under whatever metrics Lumon assigns to the Severance chips, many, if not most, of these important moments would be severed away. I'm actually reminded a bit of a line from the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once.
你一家让我心碎，我想告诉你，如果有来生，我还是会选择和你一起报税，开心一点。
It is a deeply moving line that has stuck with me ever since. It expresses so beautifully the joy and meaning that can be found even in the smallest moments, that there's wonder everywhere and how we can often lose sight of that in a deluge of distraction and discontent. Something like laundry or taxes can be mundane, boring, and tedious, but like we see in the glimpses of Mark and Gemma doing dishes together in their flashback, it can also be beautiful. However, it is utterly inconceivable that Lumon and their optimization algorithm recognizes this. Under the perfect future they offer, there will never be just a simple moment of doing laundry or taxes with someone you love. Of course, there are some truly terrible things we go through in life that we wish we could sever ourselves from. Terrible injustices happen in the world, and while there is joy, there's also tremendous suffering. I'll delve more into this in the next section as well. However, the nature of life is that while we can absolutely strive and should strive to make the world a happier place, we can't hope to bargain with life and operate on it like a surgeon removing a tumor on an operating table. If you reject all the negatives, you'll necessarily also reject the positives. The good and the bad in life aren't binary opposites of each other. Rather, together they create something greater than the sum of their parts. I also have to wonder, if this procedure existed, how people would end up treating each other or understanding each other. without subscribing to the sometimes quite damaging refrain that one needs to suffer to be a kind person, which I don't necessarily think is true. I do think that experiencing the spectrum of human emotion and various experiences, whether good and bad, helps us build sympathy and empathy towards others. While we can't always understand perfectly what other people are going through, the rich and endless well of human experiences and possibility of experiences that we all have in our lives helps us connect with each other. And I can't help but think that if the severance procedure existed, it would only serve to dehumanize and disconnect society even more. It's kind of cliche at this point to say that happiness is meaningless without unhappiness as a metric to compare it to. At times this refrain is absolutely dismissive and misses the point entirely. But it is true that negative emotions are important and a fundamental part of being human, and that emotions themselves are in fact relative. Without ever feeling fear, sadness, or anger, could we really grasp the significance of emotions like joy, relief, or love? Imagine something as simple as a person having a dream of becoming an artist. The path forward isn't easy. It's full of hard work, long nights, and setbacks. According to Kier, the solution to this is to sever yourself so that you, quote-unquote, don't have to experience any of that. No, another version of you, or many versions, can endure all of that for you. Another version of you is experiencing fatigue and boredom, spending hundreds of hours practicing drawing shapes, learning perspective, improving various techniques and skills. Another version of you is experiencing frustration, tearing off pages of a sketchbook because there's just one aspect you can't seem to get right. Yet another version of you is awake at night, disheartened and discouraged as they reflect on why they want to do this at all. Finally, at the end of all the toil, and countless severed versions of you later, you, quote-unquote, are at the opening night of your gallery exhibition. Before you are all the paintings you have done, each one unique and profound. However, you look around at all of them and what you feel isn't joy, a sense of achievement, pride, or love. What you feel is barely anything. You don't feel much connected to them at all. You know that technically you did all of this. Each art piece is meaningful, but to which version of you is it meaningful? The version of you that gets to experience success, or the version of you that toiled away at the hours of practice and improvement as your skills got better and better over time? The version of you that gets to bask in the achievement in the end, or the version of you that was considering giving up in moments of despair, only to make the choice to carry on. I don't believe that intense suffering is necessary for art, or that artists must suffer for the sake of their creations. I do believe that we should always try to minimize the suffering of others, and to try and create a world that is just, kind, and joyful. However, I do believe that the spectrum of human emotion is fundamental to the human experience, that it is impossible to categorize certain emotions or experiences as strictly positive or negative. Without this nuance or depth, we would lose something essential to the human experience, and what makes living meaningful at all. As a final thought for this section, I'm weirdly reminded of the 2006 Adam Sandler movie, Click. If you haven't watched it, the premise of it is that Adam Sandler's character, Michael Newman, finds a magical remote that allows him to skip past parts of his life, including inconveniences, illnesses, arguments, and other unpleasantries. While it seems like a godsend at first, it inevitably ends in misery. He skips ahead whole portions of his life, only to realize that he missed out on time with his children, his wife, and his family dog also passed away. At one point, he's a wealthy CEO, but he's surrounded by teenage children who he never watched grow up, who he doesn't have a good relationship with, and a marriage that has fallen apart. Long story short, the remote tries to save him from all the negatives, but the ultimate result is that he just misses out on his life entirely. He didn't end up happy, he ended up miserable. In a similar vein, if we follow Kier's teachings to their natural conclusion, what we get isn't happiness. what we get is the sterilization of the self and of life, a ship of Theseus where we sever away so much that what we have left is completely unrecognizable, or even worse, we're left with nothing at all. Sure, it's easy to say you should take the good with the bad in life, but what about everyone who suffers needlessly under injustice and oppression? Your bad day is getting stuck in traffic on the way to work and spilling coffee all over your desk. But compared to a bad day of someone living in abject poverty or in a war zone, who are you to judge anyone's desire for an easy reprieve from all the suffering? That sentiment would absolutely be justified. However, the issue is that the solution that Lumon is offering doesn't actually solve anything, or actually minimize overall suffering in the slightest. The Severance chip doesn't fundamentally address any of the root causes of human suffering at all. It doesn't acknowledge societal injustice, oppression, or inequality. What it offers is a convenient shortcut for people to be able to turn a blind eye to all of it, at the cost of the endless suffering of countless innies. A band-aid solution that placates those able to undergo a procedure that one company has a market monopoly on. It is, of course, also completely fair and understandable for someone to want severance for solace or reprieve from a personal struggle like grief, addiction, or trauma. In fact, the show clearly explores the deeper reasons why people might agree to it, as grief is what drove Mark to the procedure in the first place, not a desire to skip out on the tedium of work. What Severance also clearly shows is that this isn't a solution. Even without the Severance chip, compartmentalizing and ignoring pain or trauma is not a way to heal from it. The real solution is a compassionate support system that allows people to face and process their pain, and only then can someone heal and grow. And even if the severance process is perfect, would Mark really be happy? His innie might find some reprieve, but at what cost? He loses all memory of Gemma and his love for her. The grief of losing her is gone, but the meaning of their relationship together, their love for each other, is also gone, like it never existed at all. One version of him lives this sterilized, so-called happy life, one who never had the chance to meet Gemma, get to know her, fall in love with her, and spend years with her. And one version is still left with that loss, returning home alone to carry that grief and pain at the end of the day. What Lumon offers isn't healing. It isn't closure. It's the ability to condemn one version of yourself to be a scapegoat for pain, and another version of yourself to have never experienced the kind of love that resulted in that pain of loss at all. Which brings us to the wider societal commentary. What kind of world do we live in, and what is the nature of its problems that something like Lumon's utterly inhumane severance procedure could ostensibly be sold as a desirable solution? In Ursula Le Guin's famous short story, there exists an utopian city where everything is perfect. Everyone is happy and content with this paradise they created for themselves. There is, however, one condition that allows it to exist, one that every citizen of the city is shown once they are old enough. The condition is this: for the utopia to exist, there must always be one innocent child kept in abject misery and isolation, tortured senselessly out of sight of the rest of the citizens. There is no specific logic to the city or why this must be the case. The short story is more a thought experiment than a practical exploration. The whole concept that Ursula Le Guin was critiquing was how much people are willing to turn a blind eye to atrocity and allow others to suffer for the sake of their own happiness. She describes how almost every citizen in the city, when first discovering the truth, is disgusted and horrified. They aren't devoid of empathy. They are meant to be ordinary people. A person you would bump into on the street, your neighbor, your friend, even yourself. And yet, almost every one of them ultimately compartmentalizes their cognitive dissonance away, not wanting to relinquish this promise of happiness and comfort. not wanting to disturb the peace of this so-called utopian society. They choose the path of least resistance. They are horrified by the suffering of a child, and yet they come to normalize it to themselves. A really interesting note about this work is that Ursula Le Guin quite directly acknowledges the idea of the scapegoat as a central tenet of the story. The story has an open-ended but hopeful conclusion, which the title references. There are some people, a minority but some, who learn about the existence of this child and choose to walk away from utopia. It is, after all, not a utopia if it is built on the back of atrocity and the suffering of others. They chose to no longer be complicit in a system that so dehumanizes another for their own happiness. They are the ones who walk away from Omelas. Let's say that Lumon's sales pitch is correct. If getting severed would, in fact, deliver on the promise of a perfectly happy life for you, free from all the pains and inconveniences, would it be worth it? Would you willingly buy into that premise, knowing that countless versions of yourself are doomed to suffer in their own personal hells for their entire lives? I think Severance cuts right to the deeply broken part of capitalism that would say yes without a second thought. What Lumon is selling is not much different from what many corporations are selling today. The idea that it is okay, desirable even, for others to suffer, even if others include versions of you yourself, just for the sake of your own convenience, comfort, and pleasure. Lumon's severance chip is just a natural inevitability in a society that so dehumanizes each and every person, where people are reduced to a means to an end, from underpaid and mistreated workers to prisoners forced into labor. While it would be ideal to live in a society and within a system that would naturally immediately reject what Lumon has to offer, but one we live in now won't just accept Lumon's premise, but profit endlessly from it. The reality of capitalism is that it dehumanizes people. It needs to work. It dehumanizes people to the point where it is not at all far-fetched that people would even dehumanize versions of themselves. Lumon is just hoping to sell that ultimate version of dehumanization to the masses. And the uncomfortable truth is that this already exists, just not as a sci-fi brain chip. We may see the state of Gemma's many innies and feel horror and repulsion, just as the citizens of Omelas did at seeing the child. And yet, almost all of us live in a society and a system where we are taught implicitly to be okay with exploitation and injustice. After all, who makes the clothes we wear? Who builds the parts that our phones and our laptops are made of? Uber and DoorDash gig workers work with no labor rights and sometimes for atrocious pay, just so we don't have to experience the inconvenience of picking up food or driving ourselves or going on public transit. Amazon workers are forced to endure utterly inhumane working conditions, so people can save a few bucks and get next day shipping on a toothbrush or something. Amazon, of course, makes mind-boggling profit year after year after year. The demand is there, because we are sold the idea that all of this is okay and normal, from a very young age. And even if the majority of us do feel that it's not okay, all companies have to do is to keep people placated or isolated enough from each other to never have the power to challenge them. So how different is this really from the premise of a severance chip that cuts away different versions of you so they can bear the weight of your inconveniences, pains, and discomforts? After all, you yourself never have to face the discomfort of directly facing or acknowledging these innies. And the innies themselves are isolated in their own personal hellscapes, with no chance to interact with or connect with other innies in a similar position as themselves. As long as Lumon can normalize this reality enough to placate the outies of their customers, who absolutely may be dealing with their own pains and grievances that lead them to the procedure, And as long as Lumon can keep all the innies isolated enough so they are kept helpless, I mean, think about how all the different departments on the severed floor are discouraged from interacting. Lumon can make an absolute fortune from their severance chips. As a note here, I am not ignoring the reality that some people require services like meal delivery or online shopping due to disability, illness, or other reasons. However, similar to what I mentioned about Mark and how he's trying to deal with his grief, a solution like Lumon's, or in real life, ramping up the gig economy even further, is not the sustainable solution to inaccessibility or systemic ableism. Ultimately, Lumon does not see the innies as people, even though Severance shows us again and again that they absolutely are. They experience emotions, they fall in love, they have their own likes, dislikes, personalities, relationships, fears, desires. They are human beings, but in Lumon's eyes, they aren't.
I understand that you're unhappy with the life that you've been given. But you know what? Eventually we all have to accept reality. So, here it is. I am a person. You are not.
And they want to sell that idea to all their customers too. Innies aren't human. They are there to be a means to an end for you. It is also a reflection on how so much of the suffering on the world stems from this dehumanization of ourselves and of other people. A small minority of the extremely privileged always get what they want, while the vast majority don't even get what they need. Ultimately, I don't think that the point of the show is that this means we're all doomed to spiral endlessly in a broken system that perpetuates inequality and suffering. The dehumanization of others and complicity to atrocity is not innate to human nature. Remember what PD's card said in the very first episode of the show?
I used to think it would take a monster to put someone in a place like that office. Especially if the person was himself. But we're not monsters, Mark. Not real ones.
While what Mark and PD did in severing themselves may have been an ethically complicated decision, they are also not the root of evil. Any PD may have initially believed his Audi to be the monster for condemning him to a lifetime in that basement, but after reintegration, he understood that the real monster is Lumon, even if he himself of course still holds some accountability for his choices. The decision to sever is a complicated one that we can clearly see is sympathetic in some cases like Mark, and less so in other cases, such as the severed innie created only to experience childbirth and nothing else. But even if we accept the premise that everyone who severed themselves, no matter the reason, committed a monstrous act, their motivation and ultimate choice to do so is also not something that's innate to human beings. It is simply a reflection of the values of the society we live in, or of a sci-fi cult company that one works for. What it sells us and what it teaches us to value. It teaches people to value convenience over human rights, and personal comfort, apathy, and complicity over facing uncomfortable truths. It teaches us that exploitation is okay, desirable even, as long as it's profitable, and as long as it's cleverly packaged and branded under a different name. But like the show suggests, this is not all immutable or inevitable. It can be questioned and changed. We're not doomed to be disconnected, dehumanized, and disillusioned forever.
Let's burn this place to the ground.
At the end of Season 1, it is the collective action of the innies that activated the overtime contingency and struck the first blow in Lumon's seemingly impenetrable armor.
We're not happy. We're miserable. They torture us down there. We're prisoners!
We, as an audience, can see that Lumon is not all-powerful and not the sole arbiters of truth, and that there will always be people who challenge the reality they try to sell. At the end of the day, of course, Lumon also exists in a society that allows it to exist, and I don't think that is inevitable either. If we take Lumon to represent not just a company, but a wider societal system, we can see its shortcomings, we can see its injustices, and recognizing them is the first step to challenging them. There is a way to reduce human suffering, to achieve a happier future, even if we may never realize a perfect utopian society. The way isn't through anything like what Kier or Lumon represents, but through, as Severance hints at, ways that are rooted in love, connection, and community. At the end of the day, it is never too late to walk away from Omelas.